I was a ghost in my own village. I was born in a village called Oak Haven, a place where the winter never truly leaves the soil and the people have eyes like flint. My mother used to say that some souls are born for the sunlight and others are born to carry the moon. I didn't understand what she meant until the night I turned 7. I remember standing outside under the silver glow of a full moon, watching the other children, my future packmates, chasing each other with a joy I couldn't touch. They were vibrant, loud, and connected. I was a spectator to a life I wasn't allowed to join. That was the night the sky turned the color of a fresh bruise. That was the night the black crescent burned itself into the pale skin of my wrist, blooming like a dark flower in the dark. My mother didn't scream when she saw it. She did something worse. She took me to the village priestess in the dead of night. I remember waiting outside the small stone hut, the cold biting at my heels, listening to the low, frantic murmur of their voices. When my mother emerged, she was wiping her eyes, her face a mask of grief that aged her a decade in an hour. "Hide it, Liora," she whispered, her hands shaking as she wrapped my arm in stained linen. "Never let a powerful man see it. To them, you are either a weapon or a sacrifice. Do not let them choose for you." I tried to ask why. I tried to pull the truth from her, but she never responded. She just tightened the cloth until it felt like a part of my anatomy. She died 3 winters later, taking the rest of the secrets with her. By the time I was 22, the linen wrap was a second skin. I was the girl people avoided at the well. I was the shadow that made the milk sour and the dogs howl. My father, a man whose grief had long ago turned into a hunger for dice and cheap ale, was all I had left. The tax collector for the Ironhold Citadel arrived on a Tuesday. He didn't come with a sword. He came with a ledger. He counted our shriveled grain stores. He counted the 3 limping sheep in the pen. Then his gaze landed on me, standing by the hearth with my sleeve pulled low. "The girl," he said. His voice was as dry as parchment. "How old?" 22, my father muttered, his voice cracking. "But she is the only one I have." The collector didn't even look up. He dipped his quill into the ink, the sound of the nib scratching against the paper like a death sentence. "1 able-bodied female. Transfer to domestic service. Debt cleared for 2 seasons. My father pleaded. He begged. He wept until his eyes were red and his dignity was a ragged thing on the floor. But hunger makes cowards of us all. In the end, I became the payment. A debt transfer. A pawn handed over to the royal tax collectors to be vanished into the maw of the Ironhold Citadel. I was tossed into the back of a wagon with 5 other debt transfers. Most were crying. I just sat in the corner, clutching my wrapped wrist, watching the only home I'd ever known vanish into the gray mist. "You're going to the Citadel too?" a boy beside me whispered. He couldn't have been older than 16. His eyes were wide with a terror that made him look like a trapped rabbit. "I don't have a choice," I said. "They say the king is a monster," the boy whimpered, crossing himself. "They say he hasn't been human in years, that he tears the throats out of the women they send to his bed. My sister's friend worked in the laundry there. She said they had to burn the sheets after the last bride, because there wasn't enough water in the world to wash out the blood." I looked at the iron gates of the Ironhold Citadel rising out of the jagged cliffs ahead of us. It looked like a crown of thorns set against a bleeding sky. "I'm not a bride," I told him, my heart hammering against my ribs like a bird in a cage. "I'm just a maid." Monsters don't notice the dirt beneath their feet. I was wrong. The Alpha King noticed everything, especially the things that were already broken. The Ironhold Citadel did not just sit upon the mountain. It grew out of it like a jagged black tooth. It was a fortress of cold granite and sharp iron, designed to remind everyone who entered exactly how small they were. The air inside didn't move. It stayed stagnant, smelling of damp stone, old incense, and the copper tang of a history written in blood. This was the Ravencrest Dominion's heart, and it beat with the mechanical cruelty of a clock. I was processed in the lower courtyard by a woman named Dagna. She was the head of domestic staff, a woman built like a siege tower, with eyes that had seen so much suffering they had turned to glass. "Names are for people who own things," she told us, her voice echoing off the high, arched ceiling. "Here, you are floor detail, kitchen labor, or laundry. You will work until your hands bleed. Then you will wrap them and work some more. You will eat what is given. You will sleep in the East Wing dormitories, and you will stay out of the West Wing entirely." A girl beside me, her face blotchy from crying, choked out a question. "What's in the West Wing?" Dagna's gaze landed on her like a predator. "The Alpha King's private quarters, and if you value the air in your lungs, you will treat that hallway like an open grave. The last 3 women who entered those doors did not come back. Well, not the way they went in." She let that silence hang over us, heavy and suffocating. Then she pointed a thick finger at me. "You, the one with the wrapped arm. Floor detail. Start with the Great Hall." I became a ghost with a scrub brush. For 12 days, I learned the geography of the Citadel through its dirt. I learned that the Great Hall was a sea of dark granite that reflected the flickering torchlight like a frozen lake. And at the end of that hall hung the portraits, the ghost brides. I found myself staring at them during the quiet hours when the guards were changing shifts. 3 women, 3 noble daughters sent by the council to soothe the beast in the crown. The first was Lady Liora. In her portrait, she looked like spring, fair, smiling, full of life. The kitchen gossip said she lasted 6 hours in Cassian's presence before her wolf went into a submission collapse. Her mind had simply shuddered, unable to process the raw, violent dominance radiating from him. She was still alive, technically, staring at a wall in the medical ward, a hollow shell of a girl who had forgotten how to speak. The second was Lady Morella. She had been a warrior's daughter, proud and fierce. She lasted 2 days. They found her huddled in the corridor outside his room, her own wolf fractured, split into 2 warring halves between the need to submit and the instinct to survive. She didn't speak either. She only screamed if someone touched her. And then there was Lady Genevieve. I lingered longest on her. She was the youngest. Her portrait showed a girl who looked like she was waiting for a fairy tale. She didn't survive at all. Heart failure, the healers said. Her wolf had submitted so completely that her very heart forgot to beat. "Don't look at them too long, Liora. It's bad luck." I jumped, nearly knocking over my bucket of lye. It was Tessa, a red-haired laundry maid who had decided on my second day that I looked like someone who needed a friend, or at least someone to talk at. "They look so peaceful in the paintings," I whispered, looking back at Genevieve. "Paintings don't show the blood," Tessa muttered, leaning in close. Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial hum. "The king hasn't shifted back to fully human in 11 months, they say. The wolf fever has him. His eyes aren't even hazel anymore. They're burning gold. Pure lupin. The council is terrified. A king who can't speak is a king who can't rule, and the rival packs are already circling the borders like vultures." Is he really a monster?" I asked. Tessa winced. "He's a cursed man, Liora. There's a difference. During the Great Northern War, a dying witch from the Shadow Pact cursed his wolf, a curse that turned his dominance into a weapon that destroyed everything it touched. Bride after bride had been sent to him, noble women with high lineages and powerful wolves. None of them survived. Some were found dead before the first candle burned out. Some lost their minds, their wolves shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces of madness. She glanced toward the dark archway that led to the west wing. Now he stays locked in his chambers, shattering the furniture and roaring at the moon. No one goes in. Even the guards just leave his meat trays at the edge of the corridor and run. Dagna is looking for a new rotation for the outer chambers there. No one wants it. It's a death sentence. Why does the council keep sending brides if they know what happens? Tessa gave a cynical laugh. The council treats him like a political equation they can't balance. They keep throwing lives at the problem, hoping one woman would be strong enough to anchor him. None were. They don't want a king, Liora. They want an heir. They want a leash. And they'll burn through every noble girl in the territory until they find a girl strong enough to survive him. I looked down at my wrapped wrist. My mark was throbbing, a dull, rhythmic heat that seemed to match the distant, heavy thud I heard coming from the west wing. A sound like a heart beating against stone. "They're looking for a noblewoman," I said quietly. "But maybe the king doesn't need a leash. Maybe he just needs someone who isn't afraid of the dark." Tessa grabbed my arm, her eyes wide. "Don't you ever say that loud. In this palace, curiosity doesn't just kill the cat. It gets the maid reassigned to the west wing. And trust me, Liora, you don't want to be the girl who cleans up after a monster." I nodded, returning my brush to the stone. I told myself she was right. I told myself to stay invisible. But as I scrubbed, I couldn't stop thinking about the third bride, the one whose heart simply stopped because she was too afraid to live. I wasn't afraid to die. I had been a ghost for years. And for the first time since my mother died, the mark on my wrist wasn't just burning. It was calling. The incident that changed everything happened on a Thursday, 17 days into my service at the Ironhold Citadel. I was scrubbing the Great Hall floor, a task that sounds simple until you realize the Great Hall is roughly the size of a small village. It was paved in dark, unforgiving granite that showed every scuff mark and was used daily by hundreds of wolves who apparently believed that boots were decorative and mud was a personality trait. I was on my hands and knees near the eastern colonnade, the lye stinging the small cuts on my fingers, when the massive oak doors crashed open. A delegation entered. 15 wolves in the deep blue and silver of the Keldrath Compact, a rival territory to the south that had been circling our borders like a shark since the king's curse took hold. At their center walked a woman who radiated the cold, sharp confidence of someone who knew she was the most important person in every room she'd ever entered. Lady Vina Hale. According to the Kitchen Network, she was the woman who had been angling for a political marriage alliance with the Ravencrest Dominion for 2 years. Not because she wanted Cassian Thorn, no one wanted a monster, but because she wanted the crown and the military power that came with it. The delegation swept past me without acknowledgement. I was furniture. Less than furniture. Even the chairs in the hall got polished. I was just a shadow in a gray dress, blending into the soot and the stone. The Ravencrest Beta, a massive scarred wolf named Rurik, who moved like a boulder that had learned to walk, positioned himself at the head of the hall. He was standing in for the king, who hadn't attended a diplomatic function since the last bride was carried out in a shroud. The Keldrath Compact proposes a renewed discussion of the marriage alliance, Lady Vina said, her voice carrying with practiced, haughty projection. Given the unfortunate outcomes of your previous Luna candidates, we believe a more strategic approach is warranted. I am prepared to present myself as a candidate under modified terms. Rurik's expression suggested he'd rather negotiate with a forest fire. Lady Hale, the Alpha King has suspended all mate selection proceedings indefinitely. An indefinite suspension is just a polite word for surrender, Beta, Vina countered, sipping wine from a silver goblet a servant had rushed to provide. The Dominion cannot function without succession. The Elder Council agrees. I have been in correspondence with Lord Aldrich Morn. That name made the air in the room turn brittle. Lord Morn was the head of the Ravencrest Elder Council, a man who viewed the king's curse as a political inconvenience to be managed or replaced. I shouldn't have been listening. I should have kept my head down and my brush moving. But my mark was pulse-thumping against the stone floor, a warning rhythm I couldn't ignore. You. The word hit me like a physical blow. I looked up. Lady Vina was staring down at me, her lip curled in a sneer of pure surgical contempt. She had finished her wine and was holding out the empty goblet as if I were a pedestal. "More wine, girl," she commanded. I looked at the silver pitcher on the service station 3 feet behind her. Then I looked at my hands, dripping with gray, caustic scrub water. "I am floor detail, my lady," I said, my voice steady despite the hammer of my heart. "Not service staff." The silence that followed was absolute. Rurik closed his eyes briefly, the look of a man watching a small animal walk directly into a trap. Lady Vina's face didn't change, which was the frightening part. No anger, just the calm calculation of a woman deciding how best to crush an insect. "I didn't ask for your assignment," Vina said softly. "I asked for wine." "The service station is directly behind you, my lady," I replied. I didn't mean to be defiant. I was simply tired. Tired of being invisible. Tired of the lie eating my skin. Tired of the way these people talked about the king as if he were a broken machine instead of a man. "The pitcher is silver. You could reach it without even standing." Vina set the goblet down on a nearby table with a clink that echoed like a gunshot. "Stand up." I stood. My knees ached. My back felt like it was made of rusted hinges. I was wearing the gray service uniform that made me look underfed and insignificant, but I didn't lower my gaze. "Name," she demanded. "Liora, of Oakhaven. A debt transfer." "Oakhaven." She repeated the word like it was something she'd found on the bottom of her shoe. "A village of dirt and failures. How long has the Dominion been accepting field mice into its service staff, Rurik? The hospitality standards appear to have relaxed." "Liora is new," Rurik said, his voice a warning growl. "She will be disciplined." "Discipline is for those who can be taught," Vina said, stepping closer to me. She smelled of expensive jasmine and cold ambition. She reached out, her gloved hand catching my chin, forcing my head back. Her eyes searched mine, looking for fear. She didn't find it. She found something else. She found the mark. Even through the linen wrap on my wrist, the black crescent was glowing, a faint, pulsing heat that even I could see through the fabric. Vina's eyes widened for a fraction of a second. She didn't know what it was, but she knew it was something. "There is something wrong with this one," Vina whispered, recoiling as if I were venomous. "She smells of the shadow packs. She smells of the very curse that is rotting your king." She turned to Rurik, her face pale. "If this is the quality of the staff you allow near the throne, it is no wonder the king is lost. I want her removed from the Great Hall. I want her placed where she can do no more damage to the dignity of this court." Rurik looked at me, and for a second I saw a flash of something in his eyes. It wasn't pity. It was recognition. "Noted, Lady Hale," Rurik said. "Liora, return to your duties." I spent the rest of the day scrubbing in a fever. I had made myself visible. In the Ironhold Citadel, visibility was a death sentence. That night, Tessa found me in the dormitory. She didn't have her usual cheerful gossip. She looked like she'd seen a funeral procession. "You idiot!" she hissed, grabbing my shoulders. "What did you say to Vina Hale?" "I told her where the wine was," I muttered, sitting on my thin cot. "Well, she told the council you're a security risk and a stain on the court," Tessa whispered. "Dagna just issued the orders. You're being reassigned, Liora. effective at dawn. My stomach dropped into a cold abyss. Where? Tessa's voice trembled. The West Wing. Inner chamber maintenance. You're not cleaning the corridors anymore, Liora. You're cleaning the blast radius. She gripped my hand, her eyes filling with tears. Nobody comes back from the West Wing, Liora. Not the brides, and certainly not the maids. I looked down at my wrist. The black crescent was no longer pulsing. It was steady, a constant, low-burning fire that felt like a hand guiding me through the dark. Maybe, I said, more to myself than to her, but someone has to see what's left of the man behind the monster. It was a long, suffocating stretch of corridor where the torches flickered with a nervous, dying light, and the very air felt thick with the scent of ozone and old, neglected grief. I walked behind Dagna, my bucket clinking against my knee with every step, a sound that felt like a sacrilege in the heavy silence. The guards we passed did not look at me. They looked through me, their faces set in the grim masks of men standing watch at an execution. "Listen closely, Liora," Dagna whispered, her voice uncharacteristically thin. "You enter the outer antechamber. You do not touch the inner doors. You swap the linens, you leave the tray, and you scrub the floor. If you hear a growl, you freeze. If you hear a crash, you run. To the Alpha King, you are a shadow. Stay that way." She stopped in front of a set of massive iron-bound doors. They were scarred. Deep, jagged gouges tore through the ancient wood, as if a mountain lion had tried to shred its way out of a trap. Dagna unlocked the heavy bolt, pushed the door open just enough for me to slip through, and then closed it behind me with a final echoing thud. I was alone in the blast radius. The antechamber was a graveyard of luxury. A velvet chaise had been ripped open. A mahogany writing desk lay in splinters. The room hummed, a low-frequency vibration that rattled my teeth. It was the dominance Tessa had talked about, the raw weight of an alpha whose wolf had swallowed his man. Most women would have felt their own wolves whimper and collapse, but as I knelt to scrub the ink from the floor, my black crescent mark began to flare. It didn't just burn, it screamed. A blinding white heat radiated from my wrist, a pulse that thrummed in my ears until it was the only sound in the world. The sound of something heavy dragging across stone. I froze. Behind those doors, I heard him. It wasn't the roar of a monster. It was the sound of a man trying to breathe through a throat full of glass. A wet, ragged inhalation followed by a low, pained whine. He isn't angry, I realized. He's exhausted. I tried to fight the pull. I tried to turn and run back to the safety of the servants' quarters, but my feet moved toward the inner doors against my will. My hand reached for the iron handle as if it were a life raft in a churning sea. I picked up the fresh tray, the warm broth and hearth bread I had swiped, and pushed. The inner door swung open on silent hinges. The king's bedchamber was plunged in shadow. In the furthest corner crouched the king. He was half drowned in darkness, his eyes glowing with a violent lupine gold that cut through the gloom. His body was hunched, muscles corded and straining, as if he were trying to hold back a tidal wave with his bare hands. He looked up, and for one terrible moment, I saw the beast looking through his eyes. He was a nightmare carved from obsidian, half-shifted, his shoulders massive and distorted, black claws dug into the stone. The air in the room suddenly dropped 10 degrees. "Leave," a voice rasped. It wasn't human. It was a vibration that shook the floorboards. I didn't run. I took 3 steps forward and placed the tray on the floor. "The broth is still warm," I said. My voice was small, but it didn't shake. "You should eat, Cassian Thorn. A king cannot fight a curse on an empty stomach." The silence was absolute. I saw his claws retract slightly. Very slowly, his head tilted. He didn't look at me, but but I felt his gaze, heavy, golden, and terrifying. "You address me by name?" The words were tortured. "Titles are for people who want something from you," I whispered. "I'm just here to clean." I should have slipped out then. I should have closed the door and stayed a shadow. But as I stood there, the fear vanished. In its place came a deep, undeniable affection, a desperate, passionate need to reach him, to touch the fire that was burning him alive. It was as if my curse had spent 22 years waiting for his, and now they were finally coming home. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I walked into the heat of his power, my hand reaching out to catch the man before the wolf could take him. As my fingers brushed his skin, the mark on my wrist didn't just glow, it anchored. I collapsed into the darkness, the last thing I felt being the scratch of his stubble against my palm and the sudden, jarring silence of his soul. The next morning, the palace found me, alive, still breathing. I was pressed against the chest of a man who was supposed to be a monster, my cheek resting over a heart that was finally beating in a steady human rhythm. Cassian Thorn slept. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't the girl who was cursed. I was the only girl who was safe. Dawn did not bring light to the Ironhold Citadel. It only brought witnesses. I woke to a sound that shattered the silence of the West Wing like a hammer against glass. The inner doors hit the stone walls with a crack of thunder. I heard the collective intake of breath before I saw their faces. It was a sea of silver armor, velvet robes, and eyes wide with a horror that quickly curdled into something sharper. "Heavens," someone whispered, a voice full of a dark, superstitious dread. "She's still whole." "Don't move," a guard hissed, his sword clearing its scabbard by an inch. "Maid, get away from him before he wakes and finishes the job." I didn't pull away. If anything, the mark on my wrist, now a dull, satisfied ache, urged me to stay. I looked up, meeting Margaret's eyes. Whatever medical explanation she had prepared died there in the silence. Her gaze moved from the king's closed lids to the pulse jumping in my throat. She wasn't looking at a scandal. She was looking at a miracle she didn't know how to categorize. "The king is asleep," I said. My voice was raspy, but it carried through the room with a strange, new authority. "If you wake him now, the beast will return. Let him rest." "You dare give orders to the council?" The crowd parted as Lord Aldrich Morn stepped into the light. He was a man made of sharp angles and cold ambition, his eyes like two pieces of flint. He looked at me not with relief that his king was healed, but with the calculating hunger of a man who had just found a lost treasure and was already deciding whose name to carve into it. "Margaret," Morn snapped, never taking his eyes off me. "Check his vitals, now." The physician moved toward the bed, her movements cautious, as if she were approaching a sleeping volcano. As she reached out to touch Cassian's wrist, his arm tightened around me in his sleep. Not enough to bruise, but a low, possessive rumble started deep in his chest. It was half growl, half purr, a territorial warning that vibrated through my entire body. Margaret froze. She looked at me, her eyes searching. He isn't rejecting your presence. His heart rate, it's normalizing, in sync with hers." "How?" Morn demanded. "She is a debt transfer, a peasant. She has no lineage, no power." "She has something else," Margaret whispered, her eyes falling on my wrapped wrist, where a faint, ghostly light was still bleeding through the linen. The room erupted into a cacophony of hushed, frantic arguments. I saw the change in their faces. They stopped seeing a girl and started seeing a solution. A leash. A weapon. I saw the way Morn's hand tightened on his cane, his mind already spinning a web of political maneuvers. "This changes everything," Morn said, his voice dropping to a chillingly quiet tone. "If a maid can soothe the wolf where the highborn failed, then the North has a new anchor.
and the council has a new priority." He looked at the guards. "Secure the wing. No one enters, no one leaves, and the girl stays exactly where she is, under guard, under watch." I felt Cassian stir. His eyes didn't open, but I felt the moment his consciousness began to return. His fingers brushed the palm of my hand, and for a split second, the world outside that bed didn't exist. But as I looked at the greedy, fearful faces of the men standing at the foot of the bed, I understood the terrible truth of my survival. The Alpha King was no longer the only one in danger. I was no longer just a servant to be stepped over in the hall. I was the key to the throne, and in the Ironhold Citadel, everyone wanted to hold the key. "I am not a tool," I whispered, though no one was listening. The morning had brought witnesses, but the night was coming, and with it, the realization that the girl everyone thought was cursed was the only thing standing between the king and the people who wanted to rule his ghost.
By noon, the blood-stained linens had been stripped by trembling hands, replaced by heavy silks the color of a bruised plum. The broken furniture was hauled away, and in its place the council had brought in items that felt like insults: a silver vanity, a velvet screen, and a wardrobe full of dresses that cost more than my village was worth. They weren't dressing a girl. They were decorating a trophy. I stood by the window, my back to the room, watching the blizzard claw at the glass. I was wearing one of their gifts, a gown of deep slate gray, the silk cold against my skin. My old servant's dress, the one I had survived the night in, had been burned. Margaret said it was for hygiene, but I knew the truth. They wanted to burn the maid so they could invent the miracle. "You haven't touched your tea, Liora." I didn't turn around. Margaret was sitting at the small table near the hearth, her ledger open, her quill scratching incessantly. She had been monitoring me for 6 hours, measuring my pulse, looking at my eyes, asking me exactly how many minutes it took for the king's breathing to change. "I'm not thirsty," I said. "I want to go back to the dormitories. I have floors to scrub." Margaret gave a small, sad huff of a laugh. "You'll never scrub another floor in this citadel, child. You're the most valuable asset in the north. Lord Morn has already sent word to the Keldrath envoys. He's telling them the cursed vacancy has been filled." "I am not a vacancy," I snapped, turning to face her. "And I am not a Luna. I am a debt transfer with a mark on my wrist that people used to spit on." "And now they want to kiss it," Margaret countered, her eyes dropping to the linen wrap I had fought to keep. "Lord Morn is coming. He wants to see the anchor in action." Lord Aldrich Morn didn't wait for an invitation. He swept into the room, followed by 2 guards whose armor was polished to a mirror finish. He looked at me, his eyes traveling from the silk of my dress to the pulse in my neck, as if he were appraising a horse at a fair. "A remarkable transformation," Morn said, his voice like dry leaves. "Though the eyes still hold the look of a frightened servant. We will have to work on that. Perception is everything in the court." "What do you want?" I asked. Morn smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I want a stable king, Liora. For 3 years, Cassian Thorn has been a liability. He has lost 3 brides, half his sanity, and the confidence of the southern packs. If you are the person who can quiet the beast, then you will be provided for. You will live in luxury. You will be the king's shadow, his comfort, his leash." "And if I refuse?" Morn's smile vanished. "Then you are a servant who failed her duty, and the punishment for endangering the king's recovery is death. Or perhaps," he leaned in, the scent of old tobacco and peppermint cloying in the air, "we simply investigate that mark of yours. I wonder what the Inquisition would make of a maid who charms a king with black magic." My blood ran cold. He knew, or he suspected. Before I could respond, a sound cut through the tension, a low, vibrating growl that started in the very walls. The inner chamber doors, the ones they had tried to bolt shut while the king slept, shuddered. A hairline fracture appeared in the wood. Then, with a sound like a lightning strike, the iron lock snapped. The doors flew open. Cassian Thorn stood in the threshold. He was fully human now, but the humanity was a thin veil over something primal. He was shirtless, his broad chest crisscrossed with silver battle scars and the faint, fading red marks of his own claws. His hair was a dark mess over his brow, and his eyes, God, his eyes, were a swirling storm of hazel and molten gold. He didn't look at Morn. He didn't look at the guards who had instinctively drawn their swords. He looked at me. "Liora," he rasped. It was the first time I'd heard him speak without the wolf's distortion. His voice was deep, melodic, and thick with a possessive hunger that made my mark pulse in sympathy. "Your Majesty," Morn said, quickly recovering his composure and bowing low. "We were just discussing the arrangements for your care. The maid has been—" "Get out," Cassian said. He didn't raise his voice, but the dominance in the room spiked so hard that one of the guards actually stumbled, his knees hitting the floor in a forced submission. "My lord, we must discuss the council's decree." Cassian moved faster than the human eye could follow. One moment he was 10 feet away. The next, his hand was crushed around the head of Morn's silver cane, pinning it to the floor. He leaned into Morn's space, his teeth bared in a silent, terrifying snarl. "You brought her here to be a sacrifice," Cassian hissed, his voice vibrating with suppressed rage. "You sent a maid to do what your noble daughters couldn't, hoping she'd be shredded so you could finally declare me unfit. Well, she didn't break, and now she belongs to the king. Not the council, not the North. Me." Morn's face turned a sickly shade of gray. "She is a servant, my lord, a ward of the state." "She is mine," Cassian roared, the sound echoing through the citadel. "If any of you touch her, if any of you speak to her without my leave, I will show you why no bride survived this wing. Out!" The guards didn't wait. They practically dragged Morn from the room. Margaret lingered for a second, catching my eye with a look that was half pity and half warning, before the heavy doors slammed shut, leaving me alone with the Alpha King. The silence that followed was thick, charged with the electricity of the storm outside. Cassian didn't move. He stood by the door, his chest heaving, his hands trembling with the effort of holding back the shift. "Liora," he whispered, and this time the name sounded like a prayer. I didn't stay by the window. I walked across the plush carpet, my silk dress whispering against the floor, until I was standing inches from him. I could smell him now, the salt of his skin, the pine of the woods, and the dark, sweet scent of the curse. "I'm here," I said, reaching up. He flinched as my hand approached his face, a flicker of shame crossing his features. "Don't. I am a monster, Liora. You saw me. You saw what I do to the things I touch." "I saw a man who was lonely," I whispered, my fingers finally brushing his jaw. The stubble was rough, and his skin was burning hot. "And I'm not afraid of the dark, Cassian. I was born in it." At my touch, the gold in his eyes bled away, replaced by a deep, aching hazel. He leaned into my palm, a broken sound escaping his throat as he closed his eyes. For the first time, he wasn't a king or a beast. He was just a man, holding on to the only thing that made the world stop shaking. He wrapped his arms around my waist, pulling me flush against his heat, his face burying in the crook of my neck. "They will try to use you," he breathed against my skin. "They will try to turn you into a leash to break me. I should send you away. I should cast you out of this citadel for your own safety." "You won't," I said, my hand sliding into his dark hair. "No," he whispered, his grip tightening until I could barely breathe. "I'll kill them all before I let them take you." Outside, the council was already meeting. The enemy was already moving. But in the West Wing, for one golden moment, the gilded cage didn't feel like a prison. It felt like a sanctuary. The first week of my ascent was the loneliest time of my life. I was no longer allowed to eat in the drafty, laughing warmth of the servants' kitchen. I was no longer allowed to walk the outer battlements or scrub the floors until my mind went numb with the rhythm of it. Instead, I was a ghost in silk. I moved through the West Wing like a bird in a cage of gold, watched by guards whose eyes held a mixture of awe and resentment. They thought I was a witch. They thought I had drugged their king. But inside the inner chambers, behind the heavy oak doors that stayed locked to everyone but me and Margaret, the world was silent. Cassian did not speak much. The wolf fever had left his throat raw and his mind fractured. He spent hours standing by the high windows, staring at the jagged peaks of the north, his hands gripped so tight behind his back that his knuckles turned white. He was a man fighting a war against his own skin, and I was the only witness to his struggle. Our connection didn't begin with grand declarations. It began with the tray. On the third night, I brought him his dinner, roast venison and dark bread. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands, the air around him thick with the static of a looming shift. I didn't say a word. I simply sat on the floor at his feet, pulled a small wooden comb from my pocket, and began to work through the tangles in his hair. He froze at the first touch. I felt the growl vibrating in his chest, a warning from the beast. But I didn't pull away. I kept my movements steady, my breathing even, letting my black crescent mark pulse against the back of his neck. Slowly, the tension bled out of him. He didn't lean into me, not yet, but the growl turned into a long, shaky exhale. That was his thank you. The next morning, I found a gift on my vanity. It wasn't jewelry. It wasn't a dress. It was a pair of heavy, wool-lined boots, the leather supple and dyed the color of deep forest moss. They were made for walking in the snow, for traversing the rough mountain paths outside the citadel. There was no note, but I knew. He had seen me staring at the mountains. He had noticed my thin, indoor slippers. It was a silent acknowledgement. I see you. I know you want to be free. He's watching you, you know. I jumped, clutching the boots to my chest. Margaret was standing in the doorway, her medical bag over her shoulder. She looked tired, her eyes tracing the new items in my room with a wary curiosity. "The king is resting," I said defensively. "I'm not talking about the king," Margaret whispered, stepping inside and closing the door. "I'm talking about the council. Lord Morn has scouts in Oakhaven, Liora. They are looking for your father. They are looking for anything they can use to verify your bloodline. If they find out you're truly a nothing, they will claim you used forbidden magic to snare the king's wolf." My heart skipped a beat. I didn't snare anything. I just stayed when everyone else ran. "In this court, that is magic," Margaret said grimly. She walked over and took my wrist, peeling back the linen wrap. The black crescent was dark, almost pulsing with a life of its own. "It's getting darker, Liora. The more time you spend with him, the more the mark feeds. You aren't just calming him. You're absorbing the overflow of his power." "Is that why I'm seeing things?" I whispered. "Flashes of a war I wasn't part of? A woman in a red cloak standing over a cradle?" Margaret's face went bone white. She dropped my hand as if it had burned her. The Shadow Pact ritual. If you're seeing the witch, then the connection is deeper than a bond. It's a bridge. She turned to leave, but stopped at the door. Be careful, child. A bridge works both ways. You might be saving him from the monster, but make sure the monster isn't dragging you into the dark with him. That night, the storm returned with a vengeance. The wind shrieked against the stones of the citadel, sounding like the ghosts of the brides who hadn't survived. I found Cassian in the center of the room, his shirt discarded, his back to me. The scars on his spine were glowing a faint, sickly purple, the mark of the witch's curse. He was trembling, his claws digging into the palms of his hands until blood dripped onto the carpet. "Liora," he groaned, his voice cracking. "Get out! It's too strong tonight. The moon, it's calling for blood." I didn't get out. I walked into the blast radius, the heat of his power hitting me like a physical wall. I reached out, wrapping my arms around his waist from behind, pressing my chest against his broad, heaving back. "Let it call," I whispered, pressing my marked wrist directly against the glowing scars on his spine. The reaction was instantaneous. A jolt of pure, white-hot energy slammed into me, throwing my head back. I didn't see the room anymore. I saw a battlefield. I saw a dying woman laughing as she cast a final, jagged spell. And I saw a black crescent mark, the same one on my wrist, being carved into the air by her bloody fingers. "We were made for this," a voice whispered in the back of my mind. Not my voice, his. Or perhaps the wolf's. Cassian spun around in my arms, his golden eyes wide with shock. He grabbed my shoulders, his grip bruisingly tight, searching my face for fear. "What did you just do?" He breathed. The purple glow on his back had vanished. The air in the room was suddenly, blissfully cool. "I shared the weight," I said, my breath hitching. He stared at me for a long, frozen moment. Then, with a sound that was half sob and half growl, he pulled me against him, his face burying in my hair. He didn't try to claim me. He didn't try to dominate me. He just held me, his heart beating a frantic, grateful rhythm against mine. "You're not a maid," he whispered into the dark. "You're a miracle. And I'm going to have to burn this whole kingdom down to keep them from taking you, aren't I?" I didn't answer. I just held him tighter, watching the snow bury the world outside. We were two cursed souls in a room full of enemies, speaking a language only the broken could understand. And for the first time, the monster wasn't the one I was afraid of. It was the people who wanted to save us. The 8th day was the day the silence broke. The council had called an emergency session in the Great Hall. They didn't invite me, of course. To them, I was still a medical supply, a vial of calming draught and a silk dress. But Cassian hadn't left my side for 48 hours. He had slept, really slept. And when he woke, the wolf fever didn't just recede, it vanished into the hazel of his eyes. "You don't have to do this," I whispered as I helped him into his formal black doublet. My fingers brushed the heavy silver embroidery of the Ravencrest crest, a bird with its wings spread over a sword. "I have spent 3 years hiding in the dark, Liora," Cassian said. His voice was no longer a rasp. It was a low, resonant baritone that vibrated through my chest. "They have grown used to a king who cannot speak. It is time I reminded them that a silent wolf is the one that bites." He reached out, his large hand cupping my cheek. He didn't pull away this time. He leaned down, his forehead resting against mine. "Stay close. If the pressure becomes too much, if the mark begins to pull, touch me. Do not ask, just touch me." The Great Hall was packed. Every noble family, every pack leader, and every council elder was there, whispering like a hive of disturbed wasps. At the center of the room, looking like a queen in waiting, was Lady Vina Hale. She was dressed in Keldrath gold, her eyes scanning the room with the sharp precision of a general. The whispers died instantly as we entered. Cassian didn't slink. He didn't growl. He walked with the heavy, measured grace of a predator who owned every inch of the stone beneath his boots. I walked half a step behind him, my head held high, my hand resting lightly on the crook of his elbow. I could feel Vina's gaze. It wasn't just anger. It was a cold, calculated hatred. To her, I wasn't a girl who saved a man. I was a glitch in her path to power. "Lord Morn," Cassian said as we reached the dais. The sound of his voice, clear, commanding, and human, hit the room like a physical blow. Several elders actually stepped back in shock. "I understand you have been busy during my convalescence." Morn recovered quickly, though his face was pale. "Your Majesty, we are overjoyed to see you recovered. We were just discussing the stabilization of the borders and the necessity of a permanent Luna." He glanced at me, his lip curling. "We have already begun the process of vetting noble candidates who can handle the burden of the king's recovery. This Maid, while helpful in the short term, lacks the lineage to—" "Lineage?" Cassian interrupted. He turned, his golden eyes flaring for just a second as he looked at the room. "The noble lineages gave me 3 brides who broke at the first sign of shadow. This Maid stood in a room that terrified your bravest guards. She fed me when I was starving. She stayed when you were already measuring my coffin." He stepped forward, his dominance washing over the hall like a tide. "There will be no vetting. There will be no more candidates." "My lord, the law is clear." Vina stepped forward, her voice a sharp blade of ice. "A king must mate with a high wolf. To bind yourself to a human, a cursed human, is to sign the death warrant of the Ravencrest line. She is a leash, Cassian, nothing more." I felt the mark on my wrist flare. The heat was white-hot, a warning. Vina wasn't just insulting me, she was provoking the beast. I saw Cassian's jaw tighten, the gold in his eyes beginning to swirl. I didn't think. I did what he told me. I slid my hand down his arm and locked my fingers with his. The contact was like a grounding wire. The static in the air snapped, then settled. Cassian took a deep, steadying breath. He didn't look at Vina. He looked at the council. "You call her a leash," Cassian said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet hum. "But she is the only reason you are still standing in this hall. Without her, the wolf would have finished what the witch started years ago. If you want a king, you will accept the woman who saved him." He raised our joined hands for the whole room to see. "From this day forward, Liora of Oakhaven is under the king's protection. She is not a servant. She is not a transfer. She is the heartbeat of this citadel. If any man, or woman, attempts to remove her, they answer to the Alpha." The silence that followed was absolute. Vina didn't speak. She just stared at our joined hands, her eyes narrowing until they were mere slits. She looked at me, and in that look, I saw the next 10 chapters of our war. She didn't believe in miracles. She believed in weaknesses. As we walked back toward the West Wing, the crowd parting like the Red Sea, Cassian leaned down to my ear. "That was the first word, Liora," he whispered. "But the war is coming. They won't stop until they find the truth about your mark." "Let them look," I said, my grip on his hand tightening. "I'm done hiding, Cassian. I'd rather be a target than a ghost." He stopped in the shadows of the corridor, pulling me against his chest. He didn't say anything. He just kissed my forehead, a soft, lingering touch that felt more like a vow than a gesture. But as we stood there, I felt a new sensation, a coldness at the back of my neck. I looked past his shoulder, back toward the great hall, and for a split second, I didn't see the nobles. I saw a woman in a red cloak, standing in the shadows, smiling a bloody smile. The curse wasn't just calming, it was waking up. The adrenaline of the Great Hall died at the threshold of the West Wing. Inside the inner chambers, the air was different now. The smell of ozone and violence had been replaced by the scent of cedarwood, crushed herbs, and the heavy, warm presence of a man who was no longer drowning. Cassian didn't let go of my hand until the heavy oak doors were bolted. He leaned his forehead against the wood, his chest heaving as if he had just run a marathon. The dominance he had projected in the hall had been a mask, a necessary armor. But here, in the dim orange glow of the hearth, he looked stripped bare. "You're shaking," I whispered, stepping closer. "The wolf doesn't like being caged in a silk doublet, Liora," he rasped, his eyes flashing gold for a heartbeat before settling back into a dark, bruised hazel. "It wants to tear the throats out of every man who looked at you like you were a piece of property." He turned, his back against the door, his gaze raking over me. I was still wearing the slate-gray silk, the corset tight against my ribs, my hair pinned up in the elaborate style Margaret had insisted upon. I felt like a stranger in my own skin. "They won't stop," I said, my voice trembling. "Vina, mourn. They'll find a way to prove I don't belong here." "You belong wherever I am," Cassian said. He reached out, his fingers fumbling with the intricate silver pins in my hair. He wasn't graceful. His hands were meant for swords and claws, not silk and bone. "Take this down. I want to see the girl from the first night. The one who wasn't afraid to look at a monster." I reached up to help him, my fingers brushing his as we dismantled the noble version of me. As my hair fell around my shoulders, his breathing hitched. He didn't pull away. Instead, his hand slid to the back of my neck, his thumb tracing the sensitive skin just below my ear. The mark on my wrist didn't flare this time. It purred, a low, steady vibration of contentment that traveled up my arm and settled in the pit of my stomach. "I have spent 3 years in a nightmare," Cassian whispered, his voice dropping to a low, intimate hum that made my knees weak. "Every woman they sent me was a test I failed. Every touch was a trigger for the beast. But you—" He leaned in, his nose brushing against mine. I could smell the salt of his skin and the faint, sweet heat of his power. "When you touch me, the world goes quiet, Liora. The witch's voice stops. The wolf settles. For the first time in my life, I don't feel like a weapon. I feel like a man." "I'm not a cure, Cassian," I whispered, my hands finding the steady, thundering beat of his heart through his shirt. "I'm just me." "That is the cure," he breathed. He didn't wait for me to answer. He tilted his head, his lips grazing mine in a gesture so tentative, so full of a terrifying vulnerability, that it broke my heart. It wasn't the kiss of an alpha claiming his mate. It was a man asking for permission to exist. I didn't give him permission. I gave him everything. I wrapped my arms around his neck, pulling him down, my mouth meeting his with a hunger that surprised both of us. The kiss tasted of fire and mountain air, of years of loneliness finally finding a harbor. He groaned into my mouth, his hands locking under my thighs as he lifted me, pinning me against the oak door. I wrapped my legs around his waist, my fingers tangling in the dark silk of his hair. The power radiating from him was immense, a physical heat that threatened to consume us both. But for the first time, I didn't push it back. I pulled it in. He broke the kiss, his forehead resting against mine, his chest heaving. "Liora, stop me. If I lose control, if the wolf takes over—" "He won't," I said, my breath hot against his skin. I pulled back my sleeve, revealing the black crescent. It wasn't glowing white anymore. It was a deep, velvet crimson, pulsing in perfect time with his heart. "Look at it, Cassian. We aren't fighting the curse anymore. We're changing it." He looked at the mark, his eyes wide with wonder. He reached out, his tongue darting out to lick the center of the crescent, a gesture so primal and possessive it made a soft cry escape my throat. "I will never let them take you," he vowed, his voice a dark promise against my skin. "I will build a kingdom around you, Liora. I will turn this citadel into a sanctuary, and anyone who tries to cross the threshold will find out why no bride survived." He carried me toward the bed, not the shredded mattress of the blast radius, but a bed of fresh linens and the scent of peace. As he laid me down, the moonlight caught the scars on his back. They weren't glowing purple anymore. They were fading, turning into thin silver lines that looked like the feathers of a raven's wing. We didn't sleep as king and maid that night. We slept as two halves of a broken circle finally closing. But as the fire in the hearth died down, a cold wind rattled the window pane. In the darkness of the corridor outside, a shadow didn't move. A red cloak brushed against the stone. The first gesture had been made, but the witch's design was only beginning to unfold. The warmth of the king's bed did not follow me into the morning. By the time the gray light of dawn touched the frost on the windows, the space beside me was empty. The sheets were still warm, smelling of cedar and the salt of Cassian's skin, but the king was gone. In his place sat a single black raven feather on the pillow, a silent promise that he would return. I dressed in haste, my fingers trembling as I pulled the laces of my corset. The mark on my wrist was a deep, bruised purple now, thrumming with a phantom heartbeat. It wasn't just a scar anymore. It was a hungry thing, and it was waking up. I looked out the window. Below, a contingent of guards in the Keldrath blue and silver was departing. At their head rode Lady Vina, her back as straight as a spear. She didn't look back at the citadel. She looked toward the south, toward the road that led to Oakhaven. My stomach dropped. "She's not going home, Liora." I spun around. Margaret stood in the doorway, her face ashen. She wasn't carrying her medical bag this time. She was carrying a crumpled piece of parchment. "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Lord Morn's scouts returned an hour ago," Margaret said, stepping inside and locking the door. "They didn't just find your father's gambling debts. They found the priestess, the one your mother took you to when you were 7. I felt the air leave my lungs. "She's dead. She was old then." "She's alive enough to talk," Margaret countered, handing me the parchment. She told them the truth about the night the sky turned the color of a bruise. "Liora, that wasn't a random curse. It was a trade." I looked at the parchment. It was a report, written in Morn's sharp, cramped handwriting. Target, Liora of Oakhaven. Status, vessel. Origin, the Shadow Pact. The mother did not seek a cure. She sought a sanctuary. The mark is not a blight. It is the anchor of the Ravencrest line, stolen and hidden in the blood of a peasant. "What does it mean?" I gasped. "It means you weren't born a maid," Margaret whispered, her eyes full of a terrifying realization. The Ravencrest Alpha line was cursed to go mad, but the witch who cast it, the one in the red cloak, didn't do it out of malice. She did it to protect the power from the council. She hid the control inside a child from a bloodline so low no one would ever look for it. You aren't just the king's comfort, Liora. You are the other half of his soul that the council tried to bury. The room shook. Dust fell from the ceiling. Vina isn't riding to Keldrath, I realized, the horror dawning on me. She's riding to Oakhaven to burn the evidence, to kill my father and the priestess before Cassian can secure the truth." "It's worse than that," Margaret said, looking out the window. "Look at the gates." I looked. The Keldrath guards weren't leaving. They were turning. And behind them, emerging from the mist of the mountain pass, was a third army. An army of wolves with eyes the color of cold gold, the High Alpha Council's private guard. They weren't here to support the king. They were here to arrest the witch who had enthralled him. "Cassian!" I screamed, bolting for the door. I didn't make it. The door flew open, and Cassian was there, already in his leather brigandine, his sword drawn. He looked like the god of war, his eyes swirling with a violent, protective gold. "They have the priestess, Liora," he said, his voice a low growl that vibrated the floorboards. "And they have your father. Morn has declared you a practitioner of the shadow arts. He's called for a trial by fire." "Cassian, they'll kill you if you defend me," I cried, grabbing his arm. He pulled me against him, his grip so tight I could feel the individual links of his armor. He leaned down, his mouth hovering an inch from mine. "Let them try," he hissed. "I spent 11 months in a cage of madness, Liora. If they want to take the woman who pulled me out, they're going to have to walk through the blood of every man who shares their name. We aren't hiding anymore." He turned to the guards standing in the hall. "Prepare the horses. We aren't waiting for a trial. We're going to Oakhaven. If the council wants to burn the truth, we'll show them how a real fire starts." He looked at me, his gaze softening for just a fraction of a second. "Hold on to me, Liora. The wolf is taking the lead now." As we sprinted toward the stables, the sky began to darken, the clouds swirling into the shape of a familiar, bloody crescent. The Shadow Pact was no longer a secret. It was a war cry. And in the distance, I could hear the priestess's voice echoing in my mind, a warning from 19 years ago. "To them, you are either a weapon or a sacrifice. Do not let them choose for you." I looked at the king riding beside me, his dark hair flying in the wind, and I finally understood. I wasn't the sacrifice. I was the weapon. The scent of Oakhaven didn't reach us first. It was the color. The horizon wasn't gray with winter mist anymore. It was stained a violent, flickering orange. As our horses crested the final ridge, the valley below looked like a bowl of embers. My breath hitched, a sob catching in my throat that tasted like ash. "They're burning it," I whispered, my hand gripping Cassian's leather sleeve so hard my knuckles turned white. "The council, they're erasing me." "They are trying," Cassian growled. His wolf was so close to the surface now that his voice sounded like grinding stones. "But fire does not erase the truth, Liora. It only tempers it." We descended like a landslide. The village was a chaos of screaming shadows. Keldrath soldiers in blue surcoats were moving through the thatched cottages with torches, their faces indifferent. At the center of the village square, near the old stone well where I had spent 20 years being invisible, stood a wooden platform. My father was there. He looked smaller than I remembered, his frame stooped, his hands bound behind his back with heavy iron chains. Beside him stood the priestess, her white robes stained with soot, her eyes fixed on the moon that was beginning to bleed into a dark, bruised purple. And standing over them, her silver sword drawn and gleaming in the firelight, was Lady Vina. "Stop!" I screamed, sliding from my horse before it had even fully halted. Cassian was behind me in a heartbeat, his massive claymore unsheathed, his presence hitting the square like a physical shockwave. The Keldrath soldiers recoiled, their hands flying to their hilts, but none dared step forward. They weren't looking at the king. They were looking at the golden fire burning in his eyes. "Lady Hale," Cassian said, his voice a low, lethal hum. "Drop the blade. Now, or I will feed your heart to the crows of this valley." Vina didn't flinch. She pressed the tip of her sword against my father's throat, a thin line of red appearing on his weathered skin. "You are compromised, Cassian. This girl is a vessel for the Shadow Pact. If I kill the source, I kill the curse. I am saving the Ravencrest line, even if I have to burn every peasant in this valley to do it." "Liora," my father rasped, his eyes finding mine. For the first time, I didn't see greed in them. I saw a terrifying, soul-deep regret. "Run, girl. Don't let them take the moon." "Silence, old man," Vina hissed. She looked at the priestess. "Last chance. Tell the council how to break the anchor. Tell us how to strip the mark from the girl without killing the king." The priestess laughed, a dry, rattling sound that made the torches flicker. "You cannot strip the dawn from the sun, little wolf. They are not two souls anymore. They are one pulse. If you strike her, he dies. If you strike him, she awakens." Vina's face twisted in a mask of pure aristocratic fury. "Then they both die tonight. Soldiers, seize the witch!" Cassian didn't wait. He moved like a blur of shadow and silver, his sword cleaving through the first line of soldiers. But there were too many. From the shadows of the burning houses, more men emerged, not soldiers, but the council's high guard, armed with silver-tipped spears designed to pierce an alpha's hide. I saw a spear tip catch Cassian's shoulder. I saw him stumble, the purple glow on his back flaring as the witch's curse sensed his weakness. "No!" I screamed. The heat in my wrist exploded. It wasn't a pulse anymore. It was a sun. The linen wrap on my arm disintegrated, turning into black ash as the crescent mark on my wrist began to bleed pure, blinding white light. The world went silent. The fire stopped flickering. The soldiers froze, their eyes wide with a primal terror they couldn't name. I didn't feel like a maid. I didn't feel like a debt transfer. I felt like the mountain itself. I stepped forward, my hand outstretched toward Vina. I didn't need a sword. I felt the darkness in the air, the shadows of the burning trees, the smoke from the cottages, bend to my will. "Touch him again," I said, and my voice didn't sound like mine. It sounded like the priestess, the witch, and the moon all speaking at once. "And I will show you why the shadows were made to be feared." A wave of black energy rolled off me, a physical weight that sent Vina flying backward into the stone well. Her sword shattered against the granite. The soldiers fell to their knees, clutching their heads as the Shadow Pact power washed over them, stripping away their dominance like skin from bone. I stood in the center of the square, my wrist glowing like a star, the shadows of the valley rising up around me like a protective cloak. Cassian stood up, his wound closing before our eyes as he absorbed the overflow of my light. He looked at me, not with fear, but with a terrifying, absolute devotion. He walked through the kneeling soldiers, reached out, and took my glowing hand. The contact didn't burn. It clicked. "The anchor is set," the priestess whispered from the platform, her voice full of awe. "The Shadow Pact is no longer a secret. It is a crown." But as the soldiers fled into the woods, I looked at my father. He was staring at my wrist, his face pale. "Liora," he breathed, "your mother, she didn't just hide you. She was the one who cast it. She was the witch in the red cloak." The world tilted. My mother? The woman who died of a winter cough? I looked at the priestess, but she was gone. Only a single red petal lay where she had stood. "The citadel is under siege, Liora," Cassian said, his hand tightening on mine. "Lord Morn has declared us outlaws. If we want our throne back, we have to take it by force." I looked at the burning remains of my home. I looked at the mark on my wrist, which was now settling into a permanent, glowing silver. "Let them have the citadel," I said, my voice cold and clear. "We're going to give them a new king, and a queen they never saw coming." The Ironhold Citadel did not welcome us back. It braced itself. The heavy iron gates were barred, and the battlements were lined with the High Alpha Council's archers. Lord Morn stood at the center of the wall, his silver cane glinting in the dying light of a solar eclipse. The sky was a bruised violet, the sun reduced to a thin silver ring, the eye of the moon. "You are outlaws!" Morn's voice amplified through the valley, thin and desperate. "Cassian Thorn, you have been corrupted by the Shadow Pact. Step away from the witch, or we fire!" Cassian didn't stop his horse. He didn't even draw his sword. He looked up at the wall, his eyes burning with a steady, terrifying gold that matched the ring in the sky. "The king does not take orders from his shadow, Morn," Cassian roared. Beside him, I felt the mark on my wrist begin to hum. It wasn't a scream anymore. It was a song. I reached out, my fingers interlacing with Cassian's. The moment our skin met, the silver ring in the sky seemed to shudder. "Fire!" Morn screamed. 100 arrows took flight, a rain of silver-tipped death arching toward us. I didn't flinch. I didn't close my eyes. I simply raised my marked hand toward the sky. The shadows of the citadel walls, long, jagged streaks of black, suddenly detached themselves from the stone. They rose like a tidal wave of ink, intercepting the arrows in midair and dissolving them into dust. The archers fell back, their bows slipping from nerveless fingers. The gates didn't just open, they disintegrated. The iron bolts turned to liquid, and the oak scorched as we rode into the courtyard. The high guard dropped their spears. They weren't being forced to submit by Cassian's dominance. They were being pulled down by the weight of the moon itself. I could feel it, the ancient primal magic of my mother, the witch in the red cloak, finally finding its rightful throne. We reached the great hall. Lord Morn was there, backed against the high throne, his face a mask of sweating terror. Lady Vina stood beside him, her hand trembling on her broken sword. "It's over," I said. My voice wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a decree. "You are a peasant!" Vina shrieked, her voice cracking. "A debt transfer! You cannot rule a kingdom built on bloodlines!" "This kingdom was built on a lie," I countered, walking toward her. Every step I took left a glowing silver footprint on the dark granite. "You wanted a leash for the king. You wanted a weapon to control the wolf. But the moon doesn't take a leash. It only takes a partner." I looked at Cassian. He stepped forward, his massive hand finding the back of my neck. He didn't look at the council. He looked at me, his soul bare in his eyes. "Liora of Oakhaven," he breathed, his voice a vow that shook the rafters. "My anchor, my moon, my mate." He leaned down, and as his lips met mine, the eclipse reached totality. The world plunged into absolute darkness, save for the two of us. The black crescent on my wrist and the scars on his back fused into a single blinding sigil of white fire. The curse didn't break. It transformed. The wolf fever that had tortured Cassian for years was suddenly pulled into the mark on my wrist, filtered through my blood, and returned to him as pure, controlled power. He shifted, not into the obsidian nightmare I had first seen, but into a massive, silver-maned alpha, his fur shimmering like starlight. He didn't roar. He stood beside me, his head resting against my hand, a silent sentinel of the new age. Lord Morn collapsed to his knees, his cane clattering to the floor. "The lunar sovereign," he whispered, his voice full of a broken, superstitious awe. "The prophecy, the maid who carries the moon." "Take them away," I said, looking at the guards who were now bowing so low their foreheads touched the stone. "The council is dissolved. The Shadow Pact is fulfilled." As the guards dragged Morn and Vina into the darkness of the dungeons, the sun began to peek back from behind the moon. The eye of the moon was closing. but for the first time in 22 years, I wasn't afraid of the light. I stood on the dais, my hand buried in the soft silver fur of the king's neck. I looked out at the great hall, at the portraits of the ghost brides who had died before me. I felt their peace. I felt their gratitude. "What now, my queen?" Cassian's voice echoed in my mind, the silent language we had perfected in the dark. I looked at my wrist. The black crescent was gone. In its place was a delicate, permanent tattoo of a silver moon embracing a raven's wing. "Now," I whispered, looking out at the waking kingdom, "we show them that even a ghost can learn to live in the sun." I was Liora of Oakhaven. I was the girl who was sold for a grain debt. I was the maid who cleaned the blood from the sheets. And I was the only bride who survived the Alpha King. The end. And so, the maid who was born in the shadows finally found her place in the sun. Thank you so much for riding with me through all 12 chapters of No Bride Survived the Alpha King. This story has been a labor of love, and seeing your comments will be the best part of this journey. If you fell in love with Cassian's growl or Leora's spine of steel, please hit that subscribe button and join our pack. We are officially on the road to 2,000 subscribers, and I would love for you to be part of the milestone. Don't forget to smash the like button to help the YouTube algorithm show this story to more dark fantasy lovers. And tell me in the comments, what was your favorite moment and where you are watching from? I'm already working on a brand new standalone werewolf romance that I think you're going to obsess over. Until then, keep carrying the moon, stay creative, and I'll see you in the next story. Please subscribe. Thank you for watching.